Hey again, everyone. Welcome into Oklahoma Sooners Live on another Friday, our 11th edition with Jason Ray from Last Word on College Football. You know the drill. Please leave your comments, your questions, your debate topics in the live chat. We will get to as many as possible as we talk Oklahoma football. A little bit later in the hour, Jason will unveil his defensive line rankings in the Big 12. Of course, it's media days, and Oklahoma hit the podium a couple days ago. We will get Jason's thoughts on Lincoln Riley and player comments there and the rest of the Big 12, as well as we've got some news and notes to hit off the top. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing good, Mark. How are you, sir?
I am great. It's a beautiful, sunny summer day. And for the football fan, summer doesn't necessarily end on Labor Day like it does for everybody else. It's almost like this is kind of the end of the summer as we start to think about fall as we go into media days, and we'll get your thoughts on what was stated in just a second. But we've got a few notables, certainly, when we look ahead to not 2022, but 23. The hardcore recruiting people are not just eyeing 2022, but looking ahead to 23, and some major movement going on there as the four-star quarterback Malachi Nelson will be making his announcement here soon.
Yeah, so I think this is a big weekend for recruiting. I think to your point, Mark, there's a couple of guys that Oklahoma is looking for that could possibly make a commitment, but certainly Malachi Nelson has made his announcement in terms of when he's making his commitment announcement, which is going to be Sunday. So all eyes will certainly be on the TV and then the social media on a Sunday just to see. I think I wouldn't go far as to say it's a foregone conclusion, but tons of momentum are towards Oklahoma. So I think it would be a little bit of a shocker at this point if he doesn't select Oklahoma. He's canceled some of his visits that he had, specifically after the barbecue that he was at for Oklahoma, and Oklahoma's been on him for a while. And I think the other thing that kind of points to it, Oklahoma's not really recruiting any other quarterbacks at this point in the 2023 cycle, and they have none for this 2022 cycle. So I think Oklahoma's putting all of their cards, with Malachi Nelson. So, and he's a kid where, you talk about 2023, and it's certainly a long ways away, but he's a kid who's talked at length about his desire to commit early and his desire to kind of start recruiting and kind of building his team from a promotional perspective into 2023. So it'll be a big one. I believe he's the second rated quarterback in the country, right there with Arch Manning in terms of just his overall rating from a 247 perspective. So a guy that Oklahoma will certainly be interested in with presumably a guy like Rattler leaving after this year, if he has the season that everyone anticipates him having, and then Caleb Williams certainly being the guy next year that people would hope for, and then Malachi Nelson as a guy that could supplant some, provide some depth as far as that goes.
Don't want to shortchange the young man. So if you're strictly a 247 sports person, 4-star. I'm sure he's just bordering on the 5-star. You put together the entire composite 5-star ranking, 5th rated player in the nation overall. How he's not a 5-star on 247 Sports, I don't get it, because he is the 5th rated player in the nation according to them solely, and then also number 5 once you throw in Rivals and ESPN. 2nd rated quarterback in the country, as Jason mentions, out of California, and the top rated player in California. 26 offers, and looking at his stats from the past couple seasons here on 247 Sports, 2020, 23 passing touchdowns, 4 picks, threw for about 1,500 yards in a shortened season. And then if we go back to 2019, 8 touchdowns, 5 picks. So he certainly cleaned up his decision-making process there, going from going from his freshman to his sophomore season in high school. So amplified the impressiveness of the numbers when you consider starting as a freshman on the high school level, 8 touchdowns, 5 picks, and then as a sophomore, he puts together that kind of TD to pick ratio, and a lot to learn for him, but a tremendous talent who received a ton of offers, of course, just here in the last month from the likes of Texas A&M, Purdue, Arizona, Utah, Notre Dame, and 26 in total. Malachi Nelson going to make his decision known here very shortly, and it appears as though it's going to be Oklahoma. And when Jason gets into his defensive line rankings, I'm going to kind of tie this decision into what looks so good for Oklahoma in the future. All right. Before we get to Big 12 Media Days, Oklahoma unveiled, as many teams are at this point, just prior to fall camp, the roster and the roster update, and one positional change of note that you caught that's been a topic of discussion.
Yeah, it's interesting. Typically when you see these rosters that are unveiled a little bit before fall practice, there's some height and there's some weight differences that people want to look at, just in terms of, what some of these kids were able to do over the summer. But, interestingly enough, there was a pretty significant position change with Marcus Hicks. I know there was a question last week about, his ability to kind of break through on the defensive line perspective next year. Or this year, I should say. So it was interesting, on the heels of that, we got the notification through the official roster unveiling through the official website of Oklahoma sports that Marcus Hicks has moved over to the offensive line. So, I think a couple of things that you look at in terms of that move, was it more of his, Marcus's inability to, maybe crack that, second, third team from a rep perspective, or is it more so on the side of, Oklahoma needs, a little bit more depth on the offensive line? And I think it's the latter, from my perspective, not that, this is his first year to really play a lot. Last year had the ACL injury that derailed his freshman season, didn't get to play at all before. This is during the summer, fall camp before the season got started. So this will be his first year. And, thinking of a guy like Stacey Wilkins, who's in the transfer portal, that was looking to give Oklahoma some depth at the offensive line position. So, when you think of it, high school wrestler has, plays with leverage. I think that's certainly good for the offensive line position. So I think it remains to be seen. I think it'll be interesting once fall practice starts on, is he one of the guys that's in the two deep from a rotational perspective at the offensive line position? Doesn't really talk about what position, certainly on the offensive line that he would play. I would probably project him to be more of a guard, just from a power perspective. He was going to be a kind of play inside from a defensive tackle perspective, internally for Oklahoma on the defensive line. So certainly would project him to be a guard, and maybe Oklahoma has a little bit more depth need at the guard position, whereas they have a little bit more depth at the tackle position. So I think it'll be interesting to see how Bedenbaugh, not only gets him into the rotation, but does this cause maybe some of the other kids, maybe a movement from guard to tackle on the offensive line. Bedenbaugh does a lot of mixing and matching, especially early on in camp, just to see what that perfect rotation looks like from a two deep perspective. So good news as far as I think Oklahoma getting another body there, knowing that they're very well equipped and have tons of depth on the defensive line.
We talk Oklahoma football with all of you each and every Friday, courtesy Jason Ray from Last Word on College Football. So check out his work. Again, it's Last Word on College Football. The platform and everybody over there has been extremely good to me through the years. Jason, Kevin McGuffey, Tony Siracusa, in covering college football over there. So they are busting their tails, and they provide tons of insight and information from different experiences, backgrounds, and application to their conferences and their teams. So Last Word on College Football, give it a look. Jason joins us every Friday. So at times we need to change the schedule because people's schedules change. And so please subscribe to the channel. You hit the bell for the notifications. That way you know when we're uploading new content. You also know when we're going live, which again, we are dedicated to this 2:30 Eastern, 1:30 Central time spot. We've hit it just about every week, and we'll continue to do our best to hit it. But what we want to do more so than anything is be here at least once a week to talk Oklahoma football with all of you. So sometimes we'll need to make some adjustments. So please subscribe and keep track. And I send out notifications also on the front page of the channel here, and to let everyone know what the schedule is. All right. The schedule for this week in the Big 12 was Media Days at Jerry's World in Dallas, starting on a Wednesday, proceeding into Thursday. And Oklahoma was a day one invitee, usual coach speech. But at the same time, there's sometimes some things that are stated that will give us some insight into maybe some more authentic thoughts and feelings concerning the particular teams in the season coming up.
Yeah. So Mark, to your point, we'll start with specifically with Oklahoma, and I think Riley had a little bit, tons of coach speak from him, which is typical. That's what he does. He gave a little bit of a flex to, I guess you would say, just to kind of start the media days from Oklahoma's perspective. He talked about being excited to be back in Arlington, and he called it their second home. So I think that's a little bit of a not necessarily a knock, but just kind of a flex on how Oklahoma has been there so many times playing for the Big 12 championship. So I think that was one of the things that caught people's eye. There was some questions about, we've talked about this certainly at length, Mark, but I think there's a lot of people that had talked about, this being Oklahoma's year. And Riley kind of laughed that off, saying this is Oklahoma. Every year has a lot of expectations. Every year has a lot of, could be Oklahoma's year to kind of break through. So he kind of dismissed that, and certainly understanding he didn't want to put any undue pressure onto the team. So I think that was interesting. That I figured that comment would come up. And I think one of the prevailing discussion points, not only for Oklahoma, but the entire Big 12, was defense. There was a lot of coaches that really talked a lot about defense and really kind of from a disrespected perspective. So I think that's going to be something that is very interesting to watch for, not only for Oklahoma certainly, but the Big 12 as a whole, because I think the conference feels very disrespected. I heard Dave Aranda talking about it at length. Gary Patterson talked about it. Lincoln Riley talked about it, and Matt Campbell talked about it as well. So, I think some of those coaches, feel like that rap of defense optional in the Big 12 is a little bit dated and a little bit, just not an accurate representation of what the Big 12 looks like current state. So, no, we've talked about certainly Mark at length, but I think that was interesting that it was really kind of a prevailing comment for the coaches. I think another topic, which is certainly you would expect, on just the relief of being able to have a normal spring and looking forward to a somewhat normal fall camp. Gary Patterson made the comparison just in terms of what recruiting looked like this year. Imagine you met someone on Zoom, you dated someone on Zoom, you courted someone on Zoom, and then you got engaged on Zoom, and then you got married, and then you're face to face at that point. And that's really kind of what recruiting was like in 2020, and not necessarily the same for in person, but it was for the season in itself. But I think it was so different than what they're used to. Everyone was really kind of, you don't see kids, or you don't have coaches, I should say, excited to talk about the media. And I think that was one of the things that you saw, watching that and listening to the interviews, as the coaches were genuinely excited to come back and be there. So, outside of that, from an Oklahoma perspective, there wasn't a whole lot. Talked a little bit about Nick Benito and his rise from, he was one of the defensive guys that was there for Oklahoma, along with Jeremiah Hall on the offensive side. Really talked a little bit about his rise, and a couple years ago they didn't know if he was a kid that would ever kind of get it and the light would turn on, and it started to a little bit in 2019. He had that interception against Baylor to secure that win, and then certainly last year one of the best linebackers in the conference and the country overall. So talked a little bit about his ascension from not sure that he would ever get to that point, and other than that, the guy gushed about Eric Gray. I mean, I think more so, I in interviews with him, I've not seen Riley be so positive about a kid that hasn't played it down at the school over Eric Gray than he has. So it's pretty clear to see that he's going to be certainly a focal part of their offense in 2021. And really talked about Kennedy Brooks. And, as he would expect, he was very rusty early on in spring, kind of came on late. A big summer for him, from a conditioning perspective, kind of getting back to where he was. It said he's really adapted to DeMarco Murray's style, which is certainly a little bit different than what they've had previously. A guy that certainly they expect, there's going to be a 1-2 punch. And there was, some talk. I think it was interesting thinking about the running back position, not just at Oklahoma, but just overall. That, the kids that are having 25, 30 carries a game, that's something that's kind of gone away. There's more of a timeshare situation at running back perspective at position now, where you don't see, because the lifeline of a running back, specifically when you're talking about the NFL, it's not incredibly long. So I think coaches and then players are very, very cognizant of making sure that they understand they don't want to put a lot of wear and tear on some of these kids. So that's why, you're seeing a lot of not only two back sets, but, timeshare from the running back perspective. And so I think that was interesting to talk about. He basically said certainly would expect both of those kids to have a bunch of carries and play a lot for us this year. And, lastly, I think it's kind of funny that it's a discussion point, but it actually ended up being day 2. So the director of officials, Greg Burke, I believe is his name, had started the conversation, and one of the points of conversation was the horns down controversy. So that's been something over the last couple of years. So this was something that, in the history of the rivalry, it's been something that's happened, and I think other teams have kind of coined the moniker of the horns down, and doing that, and whether it be direction of other players or direction of the fans, and so. A couple of years ago, if you remember, Tom Herman from Texas was a guy that was, really kind of from an offensive perspective, was very much wanting that to be a penalty and kind of getting that out of the game. So he talked a little bit, the director of officials talked a little bit about that in terms of, if a player does that to another player, it's probably going to be a foul. If he does it to the fans, it's probably not going to be a foul. So, probably being the key word there, you never know what officials are going to do, in the heat of the moment. So I think it was interesting in day 2, as, Texas was part of that conversation as well. And so I think that was kind of funny that that's still a conversation piece, even, through a few years, which for the history of the rivalry, it hasn't been. So, and just kind of overall thoughts. I know a lot of people probably listening to this and watching this aren't going to necessarily love this comment, but I thought Steve Sarkisian was incredibly impressive, just from a articulation perspective, and a guy that really very clearly seems to have a plan on how he wants to kind of resurrect that program. I'm not sure if he'll certainly be able to do it this year, but I think it's probably more than anything now, just kind of watching him and understanding what a very specific plan that he has. Talked a little bit about the differences that he's seen from a mentor perspective between a guy like Pete Carroll and a guy like Nick Saban, and he's a little bit between the two, just in terms of his approach and the way he's building a program. So I think that was interesting. Matt Campbell was very, very impressive the first day. One of my favorite coaches in the country, just in general, the way that he's been able to build Iowa State into what it is this year, and love the comment that he made. He was really asked a question about why are you still at Iowa State, and he had a good comment. His comment was, I went to this profession not to be somebody, but to do something. So, it really kind of talks to the, I wouldn't necessarily say that he's going to be there for life, but I think that comment really kind of lends it to believe that he's really happy at Iowa State, and that's a place where he wants to be for a while. Now, if a team like Ohio State came calling, certainly that would be hard to say no to that. But I thought that was very interesting, and you could tell why the players love to play for him. So I think it was good overall. Really from my perspective, the Big 12 Media Days almost kicks off the season from an end of summer perspective going into fall camp here soon. So it was exciting getting to listen to some of the coaches and the players talk about 2021.
I've always enjoyed the conference media days for one reason, is that there is always a discussion, one of the topics concerning conference pride. Where does the conference stand among the others? It's always a talking point across the nation among different fan bases about how good is our conference, we're the best or we're horrible versus what else is going on. And it's always a topic on my show, something that I've broken down consistently year to year and trying to gain a real perspective on how good these conferences are. And we have the least amount of games and competition played between these conferences than in any other sport at any level to be able to fairly evaluate them. And unfortunately, most of those matchups are not fair matchups. And when I say fair, I mean equitable matchups, like the number one seed from the Big 12 playing the number one seed from the SEC. We see that generally achieved during postseason play, during, of course, the playoffs, and, of course, for the most part, during bowl season. But the games that are scheduled during the season, of course, are series that are scheduled years in advance. So you don't know if Oklahoma is going to show up as the best team in the Big 12, and they scheduled with UCLA, who 5 years ago might have been one of the three best teams in the Pac-12, but right now it's the roughly 10th best team in the Pac-12. So you don't know what kind of matchups you're going to get. And so then how do you rate that? How do you evaluate that series? Well, Oklahoma should beat UCLA, but they're still winning the game, so they have to be given credit for beating a Power 5 opponent and beating them handily. And so then you kind of compile all that for each conference, and I try to make sense of it on a regular basis. So when it comes to defense, I think it was pretty obvious to see for years and years and years that the Big 12 was not playing the caliber defense that the other four conferences, and especially two or three of the other conferences, were playing. At the same time, what was the offensive talent, especially at quarterback, being developed and delivered to the National Football League out of the Big 12? It was certainly at a high caliber, probably more so than the other leagues overall, especially at the quarterback position. So anytime you're playing in a silo and you're playing 48, 45 games and other leagues are playing 24, 21 games, then you can either, depending on your position, say, we have great offense, or it can be stated, we have lousy defense. Well, I think the one confirmation that the Big 12 has been down is obviously stepping outside a conference. Now, I do think that that narrative has been overblown because people don't tend to look at the entire conference and kind of go down the rungs. They look at the other matchups, but of course, the narrative is set by the biggest games. And so when Oklahoma goes out and loses playoff games, that sets the narrative for the rest of the conference. And then there are some other big bowl games that people take recognition of to varying degrees, depending on what kind of a deep dive you're taking. And our approach has always been to try to measure the entire deal. The one thing that I will say is that, and we've discussed this several times, Jason and myself, is that there's no question in recent years, regardless of what has caused this, that if you just flat out took the scores in the Big 12 for a long, long time and matched them up against the other conferences and just without team names, just put scores down on a sheet of paper, you'd be able to say those are Big 12 games. But over the last couple of years, I guarantee we could throw out the scores of every conference and you wouldn't be able to tell the Big 12 games. Their scoring averages, I haven't run the scoring margins and averages offensively and defensively, but I guarantee that they're not outliers. They're mixed in with everybody else because I see the scores every week and they're similar to everybody else. There are shootouts now more prevalent in the Big Ten and the SEC and the other conferences than ever before. We saw our share of 51-48 games in the SEC the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Mark. And I think, the Big 12 this year doesn't have an incredibly tough out of conference schedule. So I think, maybe we'll see that happen maybe a little bit more in the bowl series than, you have Oklahoma with Nebraska. I know TCU plays California, West Virginia plays, I'm trying to remember here,
Maryland.
Yeah, Maryland and Virginia Tech. And then you have maybe Texas has more of the tougher games against Arkansas and Louisiana, which aren't going to be tough, and certainly Iowa State plays Iowa. So you'll get it to a certain degree. They're not playing. You don't have an Oklahoma versus Iowa State or Ohio State matchup like that. So I think maybe a little bit, but in the bowl series. But I think when you look at the Big 12 top to bottom, and Bob Bowlesby talked about this a little bit. He believes, and of course he's promoting his conference a little bit more, certainly. But he made the comment that he felt like the middle of the Big 12 is stronger than the middle of any conference in the country. And, I don't know that I would necessarily completely go that far. However, I would say when you're looking at the teams in the middle of the pack, I think it's tougher. I think the Big 12 is tougher than probably it has been in the past. When you look at, Oklahoma and Iowa State are pretty much a consensus 1-2 in the conference. But when you look at Texas, when you look at West Virginia, when you look at Oklahoma State, and when you look at TCU, those are 4 teams that are. It's hard to define where those teams will go. They've got some very specific focal points in the year, just for them to to kind of get up to where. To that 3 spot, or maybe fight for the second spot. Oklahoma State's a prime example. Mike Gundy was very, very honest and talked about, that they had asked him the question on ESPNU, asked him, what's it going to take for your team to get back here in December? He said, I hate to put too much pressure on the kid, but it kind of is what it is. But we've got to have better quarterback play. Really talking about Spencer Sanders and being more consistent. So it feels like that they're strong on the offensive line. That depth that they got last year. That I'm sure that experience and depth that they got last year by having to play a lot of younger kids maybe a little bit before they were ready is big. Neil Brown talked a little bit about Jarret Doege, how he's made a great progression from last year, from the spring. Talked about him being, a real focal point. But when you talk about, just overall, when you talk about defense, there's a lot of these teams in the middle of the conference. Certainly, when you talk about, you throw Kansas and maybe Texas Tech to a degree out of that conversation. But when you look at all these other teams, they have a lot of talent at all 3 levels. Of the defense, whether you're talking about Iowa State, Oklahoma, Texas, Oklahoma State. So I think it's going to be a lot tougher. And I think one of the mentions here was really on last year, and this was brought up in the Big 12 Media Days, how the Big 12 was the only conference to go undefeated in postseason play last year. So I think that's certainly certainly the Big 12 did not have a participant in the college football playoffs. Having said that, changing that discussion point for the Big 12 being undefeated in the conference play in the bowl season, I should say, is a good point to bring into the year. And I think it's going to come down to matchups and come down to maybe home field advantage in some of these key games in the Big 12 this year, as the schedule is tougher, top to bottom than it has been in recent past. And I think, fortunately for Oklahoma, they're set up from a schedule perspective a little bit better than most. I think Oklahoma hosts TCU this year. They host Iowa State, have Texas and Dallas normally. So there's not a lot of road tests out of Oklahoma State towards the end of the year that you really look at it on paper and think this is a really daunting task. And one of the things was also prevalent that I forgot to mention, Mark, was a lot of the coaches talked about the ability, specifically some of the middle tier coaches. When you talk about a team like Kansas State, talk about a team like Baylor, Texas Tech mentioned this as well, is in this conference, when you're in position to win games, you need to be able to find a way to close out those close games. So I think that's something as well to talk about. Are these teams that, Baylor last year 2-8, I believe, do they have the ability to win some of these close games that they were in last year? They just weren't able to get over the hump. So I think that'll be another interesting. So top to bottom, I think the Big 12 is as good as it's been in quite some time.
5-0 in postseason play in 2020. I think we should give credit where credit's due. They went out there and won the games against the other 4 leagues. It wasn't necessarily a murderer's row. The compromised Florida team, Colorado Army, Oregon, Miami. But should still give credit because if you really look at those matchups, those are the type matchups that those teams should have played. Unfortunately, what should have been the marquee game, we didn't get the matchup that we should have gotten because Florida was so compromised. But at the same time, Florida was compromised. I don't think there's any question that Dan Mullen just botched that entire situation. It was, in my view, classless. You show up, Mac Brown, his team was depleted. He kept his mouth shut. They went down to the Orange Bowl. They gave Texas A&M a great game. They fought to the end. And then College Football Nation will respect that. They'll say, okay, you lost the game, but we understand you didn't have the two of the best running backs in the country, 2 of the best wide receivers, your best defensive player. That was a great effort. That was a good game. Florida just, botched that situation, but Oklahoma can't help that. And they went out and they didn't beat them by 10 points. They just annihilated them. Okay, so credit Oklahoma with playing one of the 7 or 8 best teams in the country that was compromised. So how do we rate that win? It's impossible to, but they took care of business. They didn't, again, under those circumstances, win 34-27. Okay. I was impressed that Oregon, probably because of COVID and some other issues, didn't have quite the team that they should have had and weren't completely together. But still, that's a top 10 to 15 roster in the country, and Iowa State handled them. Texas, Colorado probably not on. They're definitely not on Texas's level from a talent standpoint. But Texas, again, mauled them, destroyed them. I thought the Oklahoma State-Miami game was a good matchup in regards to, we talk a lot of Miami football on our Miami channel, obviously. I'm stating the obvious. But I was looking forward to that matchup from the standpoint of these are 2 flawed teams, but they're good teams. They're talented teams. Right. They're basically at the same level or were last year as top 15 to 20 teams in the country. I want to see what happens here. Oklahoma State, it was a good game, close game, but they won the game. So the Big 12 has nothing to have to explain when it comes to, I guess I just did, but this bowl record of 5-0, because I don't think they went through some murderer's row, but at the same time, they basically won like matchup games against other conferences, and they won them all. Before you speak there, Jason, I'm sorry. I just wanted to note, because I thought when you really look at bowl matchups, I would guess if we went through the other 3 of the 4 conferences, we would find similar competition other than maybe a playoff situation. Of course, Ohio State had to play Clemson and Alabama, and that would really skew the Big Ten's opponents. But the SEC did play a pretty stacked lineup. I just jotted this down. Ohio State, Notre Dame, North Carolina, Northwestern, Cincinnati, Oklahoma, NC State, Indiana, Tulsa. That's a pretty good lineup of bowl opponents.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's always interesting, Mark, and I'm certainly curious on your take on, what kind of momentum does a bowl win, specifically a win like Oklahoma had, specifically a win like Iowa State, Texas, like some of those wins. I think Iowa State and Oklahoma are the biggest ones. The high profile games, the group of are the New Year's Six bowl games. What kind of momentum does that bring? I mean, I've seen varied results. I think a guy that Oklahoma, a kid that was just kind of one of the most confusing players that they've had in recent memory was Trevor Knight. Trevor Knight was a kid that, against Alabama in that Sugar Bowl. Certainly Alabama didn't have the same momentum as Oklahoma going into that game. However, Oklahoma won the game. Trevor Knight looked outstanding in that game. And I think, a lot of people thought this was a great momentum builder into the next season. And Trevor Knight kind of just came back to reality, never was able to kind of recreate some of that magic that he had last year, or the year previous. So, I take a little bit into account, like it does in your season on a positive note. It's always better to certainly better to win your bowl game / playoff national championship game as opposed to losing it from an offseason perspective. But I mean, I think at the least it gives some of those teams maybe a little momentum than maybe what they would have previously coming off of what was just a tough season for everybody overall. But then, having that and looking forward to coming off of a win and then coming into maybe a more normal prototypical season than you saw last year for sure.
Somebody would have to run the numbers on that. Teams that win bowl games, do they outperform their expectations the next year or not? That would be some kind of study that could be done. I don't know how relevant or valid the outcome would be to that, but I don't think it either. I don't think it's a huge deciding factor on the next season, but I think that there can only be positive that would come from knowing that you went out against another conference. You're constantly seeing Big 12 teams, but then you go out against another conference and a team, again, that's most likely right on your level, and you won the game. And success breeds success and confidence. So I think that's a positive thing.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that point's well taken. And I think for a team like Oklahoma, who hasn't experienced success in a while from a postseason perspective, getting that win, although, they knew it was a depleted roster, obviously, but, you play who's in front of you. So to win that game and the way that they did, I think at least nationally, that has provided a lot of momentum for Oklahoma coming into the season, certainly.
Lincoln Riley's approach to how he crafts his message and works the psychology angle with his team is far beyond anything that I could do. But I would think that you would be these kids are too smart and they're too socially, in terms of social media and otherwise, aware of what's going on, that you really, I would basically say after that game, we understand that they didn't have certain players and they weren't up to caliber, but I would go around the country and say, I'd do my homework after that win and say that happened there and that happened there. Again, North Carolina was playing without all sorts of talent, and they went in and they played Texas A&M to the final minute of the game. And I would cite that and say, we just whipped a team that was playing in the SEC championship game. And sure, they missed some players, but there's all these other examples of teams that missed a lot of really good talented players and still went out there and fought hard and won games or played to the end of the game. And that didn't happen here. We dominated this game.
No, absolutely. And I very, very much feel the same way, Mark. If I was Riley, I think I talk about exactly that and say, I don't care who would have been out there. If they would have had all of their players, we still win that game. And then talk about the momentum and certainly talk about, and this was a little bit of a narrative through national media. And I think it was, brought forward through the Big 12 media days that there was really a thought that Oklahoma was one of the 4 best teams in the country last year. So I think that's the message that I give to my kids right there, right? I firmly believe you guys are one of the 4 best teams in the country and should have had the opportunity to play for a national championship. Even though if he doesn't necessarily believe that, that's a good message certainly to send to the kids. And then, other than that, talk about building that momentum throughout the weekend. Throughout the rest of the year in the off season, which it looks like it's proved to be thus far. A lot of momentum, and Oklahoma is certainly one of the favorites to make the playoffs again in 2021.
And what to me is validation about the Big 12 being a solid football conference right now is that when you utter the statement made by Bob Bowlesby, I don't immediately meet that with, no, that's ridiculous. Let's go to the Big 10. Here are the middle teams. There's no comparison or wherever. And I'm sitting here thinking, I don't necessarily completely confirm that, agree with that, but it's not a ridiculous statement. It can be argued. It's a decent statement to make. He can make that statement, and it's not like, okay, well, you've got no validation for that statement.
Right. No, I'm with you. I mean, I think that would be an interesting topic to kind of discuss, what that looks like. I think right off the top, I think it would be a little bit difficult to make that argument against the SEC specifically. When if you just think that you throw out Alabama and Clemson, you have sorry, not Alabama and Clemson, Alabama and Georgia, then you have LSU, you have Florida, you have some of those better
Texas
teams.
A&M.
Texas A&M, and
there's five deep right there.
Yeah, so I think that would be a struggle. But to your point, no, I exactly agree. I pretty much agree that that there could be a conversation at least with the other conferences.
Jason, I would do this at times. I'd put up the big whiteboard and I'd throw up the conferences, and I would seed them either technically as they were the last season, or I would put my take on it and seed them as I would seed them 1 through 10, 12, or 14. And then you just see who would match up versus whom in what conference. And it's just interesting. It doesn't prove anything. Nobody can prove anything unless the team's just played. But it's interesting to see, oh, okay, Penn State and Oklahoma State or whomever. It's just, okay, that's where the Big Ten is at number 4, and that's where the Big 12 is, and the ACC, and those are the kind of matchups that we would see if all those teams were able to play.
Yep.
I find it fascinating myself. All right. One of the trouble spots in the Big 12 during this time of defensive deficiencies of the past, Oklahoma and the Big 12 hope of the past, but we certainly have that indication, has been the defensive line not performing well on the grand stage and performing to the point of churning out many NFL players. But we've got all sorts of players ranked here in Jason Ray's top 10 defensive linemen in the Big 12. And so I tracked this along with Jason. We're going to unveil his top 10, and then we're going to look at a few players that I am going to serve up as some of the top players in the conference as well.
Yeah, so I think, and my apologies to a couple of these schools. There's a couple of these names that are a little bit difficult. So if I butcher it, completely apologize to.
I'm not going to know it, Jason, if you do. So I'm right there with you.
So starting at number 10, we'll start with the Baylor transfer, Siaki Aka, who is a transfer from LSU last year. Played sparingly the last couple of years for LSU. So I think this is a good get for Dave Aranda and his team. As you mentioned here, 22 tackles, 2.5 tackles for loss. Played a lot, was a partial starter last year, partial starter in 2019. So it gives Baylor a little bit of strength up front. I think he's at 340, 350. So a guy that can kind of clog that middle of the line of the defensive line for Baylor next year. In a team that I really feel is going to be much improved, perhaps the most improved team in the conference overall. Only 2 wins a year ago. I think they have talent, and I think having a full off season, whether talk about spring and fall camp for Dave Aranda being in his first year or his second year as a head coach. I mean, and really just kind of think about that overall from you're a first year head coach. Not just at the school, you're the first time you've ever been a head coach in your collegiate career, and
in a COVID year.
So it's really kind of the first year that for him in a normal situation. So I think Baylor has an opportunity to get back to maybe 6 wins this year and get to a bowl game. And I think the play of Ika here on the defensive line will be a big one for the Bears.
Couple things to keep in mind, everyone. I am posting career statistics. Don't want to throw Jason off on that one, but I'm big on throwing up the career statistics. They just look better. But anyway, in the case of Ika here with Baylor, those LSU stats are in 13 games. So they're pretty much similar to what a full season would be, although those are over the course of 2 seasons. Also keep in mind, of course, interior defensive linemen, it's difficult for them to rack up the kind of numbers that the guys on the edge do.
Yeah,
it's just a different deal.
Absolutely. Number 9 in the state of Oklahoma, we have Trace Ford, who's a guy that started all games last year for Oklahoma State at that defensive end position. 2019, he was one of the newcomers of the year in the Big 12. 2020 honorable mention, all Big 12 selection, played in all 12 games, averaged almost a half a sack per game last year, which ranked in the top 10 of the Big 12 just overall, and really an area of struggle, I think, for Oklahoma State over the years has really been on the defensive side of the ball, particularly kind of getting pressure on the quarterback. So Trace Ford is one of the better defensive ends in the country, in the Big 12, I should say, and is certainly primed to be as I mentioned, he came from a newcomer of the year a couple of years ago. Last year in his sophomore year was all honorable mention Big 12. Wouldn't be surprised to see him get up there a little bit in terms of maybe a second or third team guy this year. So got Trace Ford here at number 9.
From Oklahoma State, we also have a pretty good player in Brock Martin. He's played 28 games there, so he's pretty experienced. 62 tackles during that time, 12.5 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks against. Again, that's over the career for Brock Martin. All right, on to number 8.
Number 8, Iomi Iwazurke. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, so Iowa State fans don't kill me here. So he's a guy that's played a lot of ball for Iowa State. He's a 5th-year senior. He's played in the last 4 years for Iowa State. One of the honorable mention Big 12 guy last year, 8 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, 4th on the team with that 8 tackles for loss. Honorable mention Big 12 2020 and 2019. So, he's a guy when you talk about Iowa State, they've got a lot of good talent at all levels of the defense. When you talk about the defensive line, linebacker, and the secondary, which we'll get into the next couple of weeks, but they're a team that, you think of Matt Campbell and how impressive they've been, on the offensive side of the ball with Brock Purdy but they've been equally as impressive on the defensive line. Iwazurke will be a big part of what they do here in 2021.
Iwazurke, also, keep in mind as we go through this list, is the only player that I see that has amassed over 100 tackles in his career on this top 10 list, and meaning anybody else in the Big 12 at the defensive line position. Number 7.
Number 7, I have Kari Coleman from TCU. Played as a true freshman last year. He was named to multiple freshman All-American teams. Was 2nd in the Big 12 and 7th nationally with 15 tackles for loss. He's a guy that led, tied for 2nd on the team with 3 sacks, while placing 8th on the team with 33 tackles so far. So a dynamite freshman for TCU last year, and really an area that TCU has been positive just in terms of how well they've been able to play defense throughout the Big 12. Just in general, they're a team that's not new to the defensive play, and that's been a constant in Fort Worth. So Kari Coleman, one of the defensive linemen for TCU, I have here at number 7.
My apologies to Mr. Coleman. I misspelled his first name. That's why I couldn't find his stats. There we go. The TCU defensive line is going to be interesting. Not that they have a ton of top-end players, but somebody else coming up on Jason's list. But also, in addition to that, I came up with a few other players there at TCU that are formidable up front. Terrell Cooper, 28 games played, 56 tackles, 10 tackles for loss. Corey Bethley, 41 games. That's the highest figure I could come up with. And in addition to Jason's list of 10, I listed out about another 15 players. He's a super senior, Corey Bethley at TCU, 41 games played, 79 tackles, 9.5 sacks, 19 tackles for loss. As we move it up to number 6.
Number 6, I have Akeem Messador from West Virginia. Played another kid that played as a freshman last year, 6.5 tackles for loss, 5 sacks. Last year for West Virginia, and what was a much improved defense. We talked a lot about their secondary on how good they were against the pass, but part of that was how they were able to rush the quarterback and get some tackles for loss. So a young kid that has an opportunity to just get better and better. So I've got Messador here at number 6 for West Virginia.
West Virginia strong with also a player, Jeffrey Pooler, and also an emerging star at number 5.
Yeah, number 5, I have Dante Stills. Last couple of years, was just incredible on the defensive line for West Virginia. All Big 12 second team in 2019, 4 steals. Played in all 12 games. Really, it's kind of incredible the numbers that he put up. And he really wasn't the full-time starter in 2019 for West Virginia. Had 7 sacks and 11.5 tackles for loss in that 2019 season. This past year, the sack numbers were down just a little bit. I believe only had 3 sacks last year, but had 11 more tackles and 2 less games. So you can see that he was maybe even a little bit more productive, even though he didn't have the same sack number. So sort of the team leader in terms of tackles for loss and sacks for his career. So Dante Stills starts the top 5 here on the Big 12 defensive linemen.
I've chimed in with 2 honorable mention for TCU, in addition to Jason having 2 out of his top 10. So TCU should be well stacked along the defensive front, including our player number 4.
So Ochaun Mathis is a guy who led the Big 12 in sacks a year ago with 9. And I think he was the most that TCU has had at that position in about 4 or 5 years, from a sack perspective. So I think you could honestly, Mark, you could make a case for him anywhere in the top 2 or 3 as well. So I think just from an overall career production perspective, hasn't had the opportunity yet, but he's a guy that can wreak a lot of havoc for quarterbacks in the Big 12. With those 10.5 sacks that led the Big 12 over a lot of outstanding players that the Big 12 has had at the defensive line position last year, and being able to rush the quarterback and the number of opportunities that they have. So Mathis here at number 4 for TCU.
In addition to all the players that get the attention constantly because they've got their hands on the ball, Spencer Rattler, Brock Purdy, Breece Hall, those kind of guys, Charlie Kohler being outstanding at their positions. We saw it last week in going through the offensive line. There's a reason that Oklahoma and Iowa State finished 1-2 in the Big 12 last year and are expected to do the same. They have the superior offensive line talent. And then we're also going to see they've got the superior defensive line talent. So OU checks in at number 3.
Yeah, number 3, Perion Winfrey. And I think I'm glad that you mentioned that point earlier in the discussion about defensive tackles really maybe not necessarily having the same numbers that that you would see as at a defensive end or maybe a rush linebacker perspective. But Winfrey was a kid that just constantly got better for Oklahoma last year, as you have him mentioned here in his only year at Oklahoma so far. 17 tackles, 5.5 of those for loss, and a half of a sack. So I think he was a kid that, as I mentioned, got a lot better as the season progressed. He was a guy that constantly garnered double teams, which helped some of the other guys on the defensive line get and create some of those havoc plays that Alex Grinch likes to talk about. So I think he's a guy that, kind of talked about maybe going to the draft, but he, really early on, he kind of solidified his desire to come back and get better and play for a national championship for Oklahoma. So he's a guy that's going to be pretty critical to Oklahoma's success in the middle. If he continues to garner those double teams and he's able to get through those double teams and kind of finish some of those plays that he wasn't able to finish last year, it'll be certainly a big boost for Oklahoma's defensive line. So I have a Winfrey from Oklahoma here at number 3.
We stay with the Sooners in the number 2 spot with Isaiah Thomas.
Yeah, Isaiah Thomas for Oklahoma, and a guy that's really, Mark, kind of the light came on for him last year. A guy that he's played a little bit, wasn't an incredibly highly recruited kid in Oklahoma, but a guy that played sparingly a couple of years ago, started to play a little bit more, specifically later in the year in 2019. Actually had a sack in the Big 12 championship game against Baylor a couple of years ago. I think he had a sack against Joe Burrow in the playoff game, and then really kind of came into his own last year, as you mentioned here. I think he had 9.5 sacks last year. A guy who was a second team All Big 12. He seems to be, from everything I've seen, a consensus All Big 12 pick here. I think he's a guy that can play both inside and out. He played a lot outside last year. He played a lot inside last year, might play a little bit more outside from a defensive end perspective with Jalen Redmond back for the Sooners here in 2021. So, he's a guy that could if he's able to equal or even surpass his numbers. He could be, All-American, certainly first team All Big 12 this year.
And our best defensive lineman in the Big 12, according to Jason's rankings.
Will McDonald here from Iowa State, and really, Mark, certainly I think Oklahoma's getting much better at the defensive line. Isaiah Thomas and Perrion Winfrey are really good players and really capable of elevating themselves to the top spot. But I think coming into this season, based on the season that this kid had last year, clearly in my mind the number one defensive lineman coming back. 2020 first team All Big 12, led the conference in sacks with 10.5 sacks. He broke the single season record, had 33 tackles, 19 solo tackles, 13.5 tackles for loss last year, and really a defensive line that was much better for Iowa State a season ago. And then certainly with him coming back, they lose Bailey on the other side, so I think he'll be looked at a little bit more, get a little bit more attention from that defensive end spot. But I think based on what he's able to do the last couple of years for Iowa State and, the production that he had last year, I have Will McDonald here at number one for Iowa State.
There is Jason Ray's top 10 defensive linemen in the Big 12. And if anyone's noticed, Texas is absent. Here are a couple Texas players in the absence, of course, of Joseph Asai, who is one of the best in the business across the nation, who moved on to the NFL draft. Keandre Coburn, nose tackle, not going to wow anyone statistically, but a stout player in the middle for Texas in 19 games played. And also Alfred Collins could be an emerging star for Texas, has yet to take off, but certainly a talented player. In addition to Jason's 10, I listed like 17 other guys. So we've done a fairly deep dive on defensive line here in the Big 12 with 27 players. I'll serve up these two as well for you, Jason, from Oklahoma, and two players who could make their mark this year. And of course, guys that are brought up in the chat quite frequently in Jalen Redmond and Marcus Stripling.
Yeah, so Jalen Redmond is a tough guy to kind of talk through, not really knowing how he's going to come through the opt-out season. It's not really talked about a lot by the defensive coaches. He's another kid that was a little bit rusty early on, kind of came to his own, didn't really play much in the spring game. But I think if he is able to solidify himself up front, inside of the defensive tackle, I think that certainly does nothing but help Isaiah Thomas outside and, have the ability to move them to both sides in terms of maybe Isaiah Thomas moving inside at times and Redmond going outside. So I think he gives Alex Grinch a lot of flexibility defensively on that line. If he can get close to where he was a couple of years ago, I think that's going to be just a great, certainly opportunity for Oklahoma just to be even more dominant on defensive line.
A couple of good ones at Kansas State in Bronson Massey and Khalil Duke. Also at Texas Tech with Tony Bradford, and Eli Howard has 20 career tackles for loss and 14.5 sacks there for Texas Tech. And, the bad news just continues for Kansas. Their best defensive lineman, Marcus Harris, moves to Auburn. So he's gone. All right. So there we go. Pretty deep dive again on top defensive linemen, 27 listed in total. And, the point I wanted to make that I mentioned earlier. So I went through, okay, here's Jason's top 10. Let's see who else could be considered. So I went through, again, 17 players here in addition to that. Then I thought, okay, there's obviously going to be freshmen coming into college football this year who could possibly make a mark. I think this is very telling for Oklahoma for football versus the rest of the Big 12. I went through the top 300 players in the 2021 class looking for defensive linemen. There are 4 coming into the ranks in 2021, all Oklahoma players. Nobody else represented. Clayton Smith, Ethan Downs, Kelvin Gilliam, Nathan Rawlings. I don't know.
Yeah.
Can't make out his last name. But anyway, 4 top 300 guys at defensive line, and they're all signed to Oklahoma.
I mean, and I think that plays into exactly what we had talked about in terms of Marcus Hicks moving over from defensive line to offensive line. All of that talent that Oklahoma has on the defensive line, and a lot of those kids may not have the opportunity to play. So the depth that Oklahoma has at that line is going to be exciting to watch for Oklahoma fans this year, to see exactly how disruptive and how much better they can be. You know, they improved from about 27, 28 points per game to 21. A lot of that was because of the improvement on the defensive line. So it remains to be seen if that can get any better here in 2021.
Want to remind everyone, as Clint asked, and a couple other people in the live chat, and this happens on a regular basis. Of course, we collect viewers as we go. So many of the topics that you want to hear about, we've already hit on, including Marcus Hicks' move from defense to offense. And Jason has outlined that. So wait for the video to post. It should take about 15 minutes after we get done here. And we went over Big 12 media days from the Oklahoma perspective and other teams' perspective. We talked Big 12 defense. We talked Oklahoma recent commits, and of course, Malachi Nelson announcing soon. Also talked again Marcus Hicks as we preceded our Big 12 rankings on the defensive front. And I want to remind everyone that in addition to you liking the video, as many have encouraged others to do, so we thank you for doing that. It helps the YouTube algorithms, but also let people out there know that love Big 12 football and Oklahoma in particular, that we're here every Friday. We love the views that come in after the video is posted, as we typically have 50, 60, 70 people here watching us live, and then post the videos, and we get anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 views total. But it would be great to have a larger live presence. So whether you can catch it live or on the recorded version that posts, please let college football fans out there know that we're here every Friday. So just don't enjoy it yourself, but bring along a few friends as well. I know Jason's going to have his predictions at some point across the nation, but 28AD 28 is asking about how many teams in the Big 12 do you expect to hit postseason play?
So I think at least 7. Mark, I mean, you can certainly mark Kansas off the list. So I think you got 9 in play. So I think Texas Tech is interesting. You know, really at what most believe are probably going to be 8 or 9 in the conference. Most have Texas Tech at number 9. So offensively, I think they're going to put up some points with Tyler Shuck coming over from Oregon. Got some good receivers, good running back. So I think they're going to score some points. How good can their defense be? They're pretty strong at the linebacker position, but a little bit weaker on the defensive line than the secondary. So their team, big opening game for them when they play Houston. If they can win that game, they got a couple more winnable games in the non-conference slate, should put them in a position to start 3-0 in the season. So at that point, they need to find 3 more. Can they find that? Not sure if they can quite get there. Kansas State is another one that, for me, that's probably a little bit on the bubble. Was incredibly strong to start the year last year, then kind of fell down a little bit. A lot of that had to do with Skylar Thompson being out. He looks to be healthy. If he can be healthy for a complete year, I think Kansas State has the opportunity again. We talked a lot about non-conference early in the discussion here. A big game against Stanford to start the year for Kansas State. From a non-conference perspective. So I think I've got 7 that will absolutely, no questions asked, in my opinion, get to a bowl game. But then you've got 2 that are kind of on the bubble. So we'll dissect their schedules a little bit more as we get closer to the game, to the season starting. But I think 7 definite, and then I've got 2 that are kind of on the bubble.
All right. Another Oklahoma Live, I believe, is in the books. We appreciate everybody stopping by. I would like everyone to note that as you gear up for the college football season, and the Oklahoma season in particular, that you want to gear up in terms of your items that you use to tailgate and just have around the house. So we have a ton of them available at voiceofcollegefootball.com. So please check us out right there. And I was going to take a snapshot, but let's leave that for another time. Voice of College Football screenshot. voiceofcollegefootball.com. Just go to the top of the page and you see the listing of store. Just go into the store. You can choose your team. So even if you don't root for Oklahoma and you're here, then you can choose your team. And we've got everybody represented right there. And just check out the merchandise right there at voiceofcollegefootball.com. Jason, we always appreciate you stopping by. And more than stopping by, just being the anchor to this endeavor that we've got here, talking Oklahoma football live every week. We appreciate it and wouldn't be able to do it without you.
No problem, Mark. Glad to be here. Glad to do it.
All right, everyone. We will see you next week. And again, we are one day closer to college football. So we will see everybody back here next week. Bring a friend.